Hey everybody, welcome back. So today we're going to dive into the beginning of chapter 11. I want you guys to get a feel for what the situation was at the beginning of the war. So at the beginning of the war, both sides have some definite disadvantages, but one side has way more advantages, and that's the Union. So let's take a look. I didn't get to show you the title page. There's the title page. The Civil War, chapter 11. Read chapter 11, section 1 tonight. Don't be lazy. Alright, so the Civil War begins. Remember, Lincoln's elected. And when Lincoln's elected, there are a lot of people in the South who are not happy about this. And it's so bad that some of the states actually break away. 7 of them, mostly in the Deep South. It's now that we're going to see the rest of the South break away as well. So, if we take a look here, you are going to see that the Confederates actually begin the war. Lincoln doesn't really have any good options. Confederate troops began seizing government property all over the South, right? So they're seceding and they're saying, well, this government building over here, the Union owns it. Well, we're breaking away, so we're not going to respect that anymore. They actually begin taking property. Lincoln has a dilemma when the Confederates start firing on Fort Sumter, which is off the coast of South Carolina. Do you fight or evacuate? If you fight, you're making this a legitimate war, and you're saying, yes, we are at war. Yes, the Confederates are a different country. If you evacuate it, you're saying that the Confederates actually won the first battle of the war. He can't do that. He doesn't want he's still trying to avoid a civil war at this point, Lincoln. So he couldn't evacuate them. You can't fight. So he kind of makes a third option. He says, well, I'm just going to send food to hungry men in Fort Sumter. Now, in reality, they were resupplying the fort, which had run out of ammunition and things like that. When he sends troops with food, he actually begins raising an army as well. And when he begins raising an army, we're going to see both sides are energized. So after Fort Sumter, both sides are energized, like I just said. Lincoln calls for troops to be raised in the North as a precaution. Virginia basically says, oh, look, they really do want to secede, and that's all she wrote. They break off as well. Now, if you look here, you're going to see, remember, 7 states, all in the Deep South, starting with South Carolina, Florida, Georgia, and then moving their way all the way across to Texas, start breaking away. Now, Virginia leaves, which was considered the most moderate of the Confederate states at the time, and Tennessee, and North Carolina, and Arkansas all leave the Union, bringing this to 11 states in total. Now, if you look here, the blue is the Union. In reality, Oregon and Nevada will play almost no role in this war. Neither will California. But as we look here at the states that are in dark blue, these are all the free states where slavery was not allowed. The light blue states are slave states that stayed loyal to the Union. Maryland, West Virginia will actually be created out of Virginia during the war because West Virginia was largely anti-slavery because they didn't have any. Delaware, Kentucky, and of course Missouri. So they will stay in the Union. This flag down here is the actual flag of the Confederacy. A lot of times you'll see the one that they call the Stars and Bars. That was actually the battle flag of Robert E. Lee's army. That was not the government's flag. So let's take a look at the advantages and disadvantages of both sides. Look at that dope chart I made. You guys should all be proud of me. Okay. So the strategy, the Union's strategy, they actually called the Anaconda Plan. And I should really have a picture in here. I don't. I'll have to add one in. The idea, right, an anaconda is a big snake that constricts people. It gets around you and then it crushes you slowly until you can't breathe. That is their plan. They're going to basically have 3 parts to this plan. 1, blockade southern ports. How does the South make their money? Mostly through selling cotton. If you stop them from being able to sell cotton overseas, what you're doing is you're choking off their money supply. 2, capture the Mississippi River, which runs The Mississippi River runs right down through here. If you can split the Confederacy by splitting off the Mississippi River, what you're going to do is choke their trade within the Confederacy, stop their movements. Remember, they have almost no railroads. The rivers are their main way of getting around. If you get rid of that, you really hamper their ability to wage war. And the last was to capture Richmond, Virginia, which Richmond, Virginia is right about there. So it's maybe there. Very close to Washington, D.C., which sits right here. So it's a three-part strategy. Now, what advantages does the Union have? Almost all of them. The Union is in such a better situation. They have a much larger population, as you see here. Way more manufacturing. They can produce almost everything they need for the war, whereas the South will have to buy it from overseas. They have a much bigger railroad system, which might not seem like a big deal today, although it still is. But the Union can move troops and goods at a much, much faster rate than can the Confederates. Also, this one seems kind of odd. They have much more food production. That seems strange, doesn't it? The South is agricultural. The South has tons of farms. However, they are all growing cotton and tobacco. They are not growing food in large numbers. The North is the breadbasket. If you think way back to the beginning, the North is the breadbasket. Pennsylvania, New Jersey, the Garden State, New York, they're producing things like beans, wheat, things that you eat. Confederacy is going to have a hard time with food production. Another thing is they have a much more established government, right? The American government had been up and running since 1776 and under the Constitution since the 1780s. Without an established government, the Confederacy had a really, really hard time making sure that they could get things done, especially since each state had way more states' rights in the Confederacy than they did in the Union. So President Jefferson Davis of the Confederacy has a really hard time getting states to go along with government plans. But there are a few disadvantages, although they're not as huge. The first one is the Union has a much less compelling cause. What do I mean by that? It's really hard to get a guy to say, well, the cause at the beginning of the war was Union, keeping the Union together. And a lot of guys say, well, I don't care if Mississippi's part of the United States. I don't want to die. Who cares? The war was not yet about slavery. This is something that a lot of people don't recognize. They think that from day one, people said, well, we've got to stop slavery. We have to go to the Civil War. That doesn't happen until after the Battle of Antietam, which is a full 2.5 years into the war. The average person did not care in the North about what was going on in Mississippi. It had zero effect on their life. Going and getting shot at by Robert E. Lee's army has a direct impact on your life. So the idea of union, keeping the Union together, was not a very compelling cause at the beginning of the war. It's one of the reasons why Lincoln makes the war about slavery. And the second is they have to completely defeat the Confederacy. They cannot just fight them to a standstill. They have to go capture the entire country, capture Richmond. If they can do that, they'll win the war. That's a tall task. That really is a tall task. Look at this dope chart I made for the Confederacy. All right, strategy. The Confederacy has an easier war to win, and that seems like a strange way to say it, but the Confederacy simply has to get the Union to leave them alone. That is what they want. They're not trying to capture Washington, D.C. They want to be left alone to run their own affairs. So when they do that, they just need the Union to get sick of fighting and stop. So they don't have to capture cities. They can win victories on a battlefield and then go back to the South. That is what is going to happen. Oh, excuse me. Wore myself out making all these charts. Advantages. They do have a few advantages, but they're not nearly as large as the Union. One, they have the best generals in the war. That is pretty undeniable. Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, P.G.T. Beauregard, Albert Sidney Johnson, although he's killed pretty early on. Who else? James Longstreet. I mean, you can keep going. The South has a ton of great generals. They also have a really, really strong military tradition. For any of you who have ever lived in the South, you'll know that's true, even today. not a lot of northern kids think about joining the military right after high school. In the South, it's a badge of honor. If on decision day, you know how they always do that, and they put up the billboard down outside of guidance about where everybody's going to college. In the South, there are a lot of kids. Decision day is which branch of the military are you going into, and it's a real pride thing. I'm going to be a Marine. I'm going to go into the Army. I want to be in the Air Force or the Navy. So the strong military tradition meant that these men really were more willing to fight. Another thing, they're way more motivated than Northern soldiers. Remember I said I don't really want to go die to keep the Union together? The South has a much more motivated fighting man. They're defending their homeland, right? If you're a Virginian and Lincoln is sending an army into Virginia, you're going to be way more likely to want to fight to, in your mind, protect your homeland. But they have massive disadvantages. Way fewer people, almost no manufacturing to speak of. Their economy was completely dependent on sending things to the north. Remember, they sold all that cotton to northern factories, or they sent it to Britain. Well, they're also being blockaded now by the north. So the north isn't buying their cotton, and Britain's having a harder time getting it, so they're not making nearly as much money. The government in the South, like I mentioned before, was not working all that well. The states were not complying with Jefferson Davis's war plan. They weren't sending as much money and troops and food as he was hoping, so it was harder to get them on the same page. And lastly, far fewer railroads. It's really hard to move troops. The Union would put troops on a train and move them hundreds of miles in a day. The South had to march. Stonewall Jackson's army, when he goes back and forth through Virginia, walks. Does a 150-mile march 3 times. That's very taxing, and it's slow. All right, quick chart. Northern and Southern resources. Naval ship tonnage, meaning how much stuff can they haul in ships. Look at that. The North can haul 25 times as much stuff on ships. Iron production. For every ton of iron that the South can produce, the North can produce 15 tons. That means cannons, ironclad ships, rifles. Firearms production, 32-1. For every 1 rifle the South could make, the North could pump out 32. And by the end of the war, that'll actually become much a bigger disparity. Let's look here. Population. In millions. The North has over 20 million. The South has under 10, which means fewer workers, fewer soldiers, fewer people running things back at home, eligible for military service. The North has 4 million men eligible for military service, and that number will keep growing as more immigrants come into the country. The Confederacy barely has 1 million. Population in terms of industrial workers, over 1 million industrial workers for the North. I think the South had something like almost 200,000. Not even. Well under 200,000. This is a huge disparity, and we're going to see this becomes just more and more prominent as the war goes on. So that's all for today's video. You should be working on your project. I will see you guys tomorrow when we'll talk about the first battles of the war.